Hello, you are listening to Poured Over, the Barnes & Noble podcast. My name is Chris Gillespie, and I have the pleasure of being your host for this episode. My guest today is a talented writer who is perhaps best known for his terrifying 2020 novel, The Chain, his riveting 2022 thriller, The Island, and his ongoing series of detective novels starring Detective Inspector Sean Duffy, the latest installment of which, number 7, the Detective Up Late, hits bookshelves this August. Also, if you were in Manhattan between 1993 and 1995, you may also recognize him from his stint at the 82nd and Broadway Barnes & Noble store in New York City. Yes, he's a fellow Barnes & Noble bookseller and also a very talented writer. We're so happy to have him. Please join me in welcoming Adrian McKinty.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for being here, Adrian. I'm really excited to get to talk about the latest chapter of the Sean Duffy saga, The Detective Up Late. Before we get going, I was wondering if you'd be able to set the scene for listeners of who Sean Duffy is and what's going on in his life when The Detective Up Late opens.
So yeah, he's a Catholic detective who lives in Belfast in the 1980s. 1980s Northern Ireland, for people who are not familiar with it, it was a fairly apocalyptic landscape. The IRA had been waging this campaign against Britain for the previous 10 years. So by the time we got to the 1980s, it sort of resembled London after the Blitz. Lots of burned out buildings, burned out cinemas. There was no real investment from international corporations. A lot of people were emigrating. The whole thing was an absolute nightmare. Into that milieu, he's a Catholic cop trying to do ordinary police work in a situation where it's almost like a low-level civil war. Added to that, the atmosphere of, at least that is the way I remember, I was a child in that era, constant rain, grey skies, army helicopters flying over the city, but sort of Blade Runner landscape, and then you put an ordinary copper in there trying to solve regular murders and whatever. The series originally began as a trilogy, and then with the popularity, I wrote a fourth, a fifth, and a sixth, and now we're at book number 7.
To your point, the low-level conflict going on in Ireland, that's usually referred to as the Troubles, right? For listeners who may be unfamiliar.
Yeah, it's almost struck me as a really odd euphemism for which is really like how low key do you want to this thing where like basically bombs are going off every day. You know, there was shootings at night, riots on the street. All of these riots just were never even reported on the news. You'd be walking home from school and there'd be a riot going on with people attacking police Land Rovers, or there'd be shootings and bombings or whatever. Every day of my childhood, that was the landscape. And then years later, I thought to myself, I was hunting around for an idea for a mystery novel. And I thought, well, my goodness, I've got this incredible milieu. If I could get the right characters in the right location and then give them a story, the landscape and the atmosphere will just write itself, which it actually did.
I would agree with that, yes. And for this particular installment, number 7, we're joining Sean Duffy pretty late in his career, almost so late that it's almost over by the time the book is starting. He's literally getting ready to retire, and he's just doing the famous one last case.
It's quite the cliche, the famous last case of the copper. I remember there was a Michael Douglas movie where called Falling Down, and the cop who was investigating him, I think it was Robert Duvall. It was his last week on the job, and all the other coppers are going, "Oh my God, last week on the job! What's going to happen? Are you going to get shot? You're about to get your pension. What's going to happen?" So I sort of lived that cliche of the last case or the last week on the job. And what's going to happen. And for Duffy's last case, on the surface, he's been given a really mundane one. It's just a teenage girl who apparently has run off from home. And she's run off before. None of the other policemen, or peelers as they're called, are interested at all in looking into this case. But it's the last one on his ledger. So he decides to start digging, and as he starts digging, as is the way of these things, it turns out that it's a lot more complicated than it first appears.
That's right. And I think an important element to add to here too is that the missing girl is from a kind of subculture community in Ireland that's kind of on the fringes. Would you be able to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, when I grew up, there were a lot of Irish travelers around. They've got their own culture, their own language, actually. It's called Shelta. There's some very, very famous traveler people. Tyson Fury, who's the world heavyweight champion of the world, boxing champion. He's a traveler. Travelers have been around for about 1,000 years. But at least in the 80s, I think still today, there's a lot of prejudice against them, a lot of racism, and basically they were looked down upon and discriminated against. And so another reason why this case isn't taken seriously, it's a traveler case. This is just going to give us grief. No one's going to care about it. It's of no interest to us at all. But for me as a writer, it gave me a really good way of going into another subculture, another world. I mean, Northern Ireland at the time, it wasn't just Protestants and Catholics. There were all these other little interesting subgroups that you can explore and have fun with.
As a reader, I thought it was fascinating because I was familiar with, Ireland, Northern Ireland, the conflict, the troubles, but I had no idea that there was this whole other, kind of smaller community on the fringes going on. And it is, to your point, such a sad tale of like how much prejudice ends up affecting what police focus on and what investigations happen, how seriously they handle them. Because on one hand, missing person cases, a lot of times missing, woman cases, if they're younger, those can become sensationalized headlines and become national stories, at least here in America. But then it takes very little for those same stories to become almost nothing, like a blip that the police don't even want to investigate.
Yeah, exactly. In this case, I like the fact that when Duffy arrives, the cops are so over it. They're not interested in it. They're just fed up. But Duffy just goes, nope, it's a case in our books. Let's take it seriously. Let's see where it goes. And it goes in very, at least to me, interesting places.
Very surprising directions. Yes, I would agree with that. This being your 7th novel with Sean Duffy, what kind of things are you still learning about him as a character at this point? Like, are you writing and you're like, oh, wow, I guess that is a character trait that he has that I've never really thought about before.
Yeah, it's been really, really fun. Just every book, you just get a little bit deeper and you get a little bit more interesting in where he's going. And I think he's matured more. Certainly from the earlier books, he was very, very impulsive and he did crazy things. In the last book, in book 6, there was this real moment of reckoning where he thought, well, here I am in my late 40s and I'm still doing this stuff, the stuff that a younger man would do. And I need to grow up. I've got responsibilities now. I have a wife of sorts. He's not actually technically married and he has a child and he's trying to be more mature. And I like those levels where he's exploring himself. Sometimes that can be the funnest thing to do in a book is have the character reflect on who they are and their times they're living in and their existence. And I like that kind of stuff. But there's also moments in this book where he's incredibly immature and does really reckless things. Like there was, which took me by surprise because there was a scene where it's not that big of a spoiler. There's a scene where he gets in a fight, like 5 or 6 chapters in. And the way, when I was writing that, the way that was going in my head was, well, Duffy's an older man. He's not going to get in a fist fight. He's a policeman. He's an older man. He's more of a peacemaker. He's not going to get in a fist fight with his next door neighbor. That's ridiculous. It's not going to happen. And yet, as I was writing it, the whole thing escalated. And I found the character because, oh my God, what are you doing there? Don't do this. And he knew what was happening. He was in a bloody fist fight with his next door neighbor. And I was going, oh, wow. That totally took me by surprise. And, quite pleasantly surprised. And I says, oh, there's life in the old dog yet. He hasn't quite got rid of all these immature instincts and recklessness. So I kind of enjoyed that and was a little taken aback. That wasn't the way that scene was supposed to go or had gone in my head.
That's so cool. I mean, that scene does stand out to me. And it was like reading it, I kind of got that same journey and that impression of like, oh, well, certainly he's not. I mean, he's mature now. Like I I recognize that there are scenes like this from, earlier adventures that he's had that it was reminiscent of. And I was like, oh, well, he probably would have handled this one way, but certainly he's more mature. He's about to retire or enter this new phase of his career. He's not going to go completely ballistic on this man. But then all of a sudden I'm like, wait, oh my God, what's happening? I'm like, well, he has so much, because I also think to like just set the frame or set the scene for the listener. He's also kind of in this weird position because he's literally, in addition to moving into a new part of his career, he's also physically moving. He and his partner and their daughter are leaving the house that they were in originally, which was outside of Belfast, because they're like, this is not safe to raise a family here. This is crazy. So they moved to Scotland, where it's going to be a little bit more quiet and a little bit more safe. And there's this really interesting metaphor and something that you keep kind of going back to of his commute across the water back to Ireland. It's kind of like he's trying to get into this more relaxed, safe headspace in Scotland, but he's got to do this case, and he just keeps going back into the darkness kind of, and going across that water and going back to that old world. So when he is in Scotland and he lashes out at his neighbor, I got the impression that he was like, he has so much built up aggression and tension because of all this that he had an opportunity to let loose on this neighbor, and he just went for it.
Yeah, I mean, there's the couple things I want to parse there. One of the things is the idea of leaving. Ken Branagh made that film Belfast a couple of years ago, and it was all him leaving Belfast. And I think he left in the early 70s, mid 70s, or something like that. And a big part of my childhood, I was basically in high school throughout the 80s. A big part of my childhood was people just leaving. And 1 year, a third of our high school class left. They emigrated to Canada or the US or Scotland or England or Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. They were just, they all were left. And the ones that were left behind, like me, my family, we didn't go. And I was going, why can't we go? Why can't we go to Canada or the US or whatever? And occasionally those kids would send back postcards, but they usually dried up after a while. They said, oh yeah, we'll definitely keep in touch. But they didn't, for the first 6 months maybe. And you knew what was happening. Their lives were just so interesting. Where they'd moved to, they were living in New York or Los Angeles or Sydney or wherever. They didn't want to think about Northern Ireland anymore. They didn't want to think about the people that left behind. But we were the ones left behind, and we felt so sort of rejected and disconsolate. It was a bit like that TV show, The Leftovers. Mm-hmm. They don't focus on the ones that have, I don't really know what happens to them. They transcend, they go to another place. It focuses on the ones who are left behind. And that's what we were like. And so Duffy's in an interesting place because he moves his family out, but he still has to finish his job. So he does have to take the ferry back. And then he has to go into two different headspaces. The headspace of living in Scotland where there's no war, there's no violence, no one's going to shoot him. The people are having barbecues and going to the DIY center and going to IKEA. And then back in the Northern Ireland where there's nothing like that. And it's just live and let live. It's a bit like, there's an amazing scene from, and I think this had a big impact on me. There's an amazing scene from The Hurt Locker. Did you ever see that? The Hurt Locker, Catherine Bigelow.
I remember seeing it when it first came out many years ago, yes.
The scene that blew my mind wasn't any of the explosives or, trying to do the IUD devices and diffuse them in Iraq. The scene for me was the guy does a 12-month tour in Iraq and then comes back and he's in a supermarket and his wife asks him to get some cereal. And he's in this brightly lit supermarket with the UV lights and there's 150 types of cereal, and he has a panic attack because it's just too much for him. The world he knows is very, very simple. Cut the red wire, cut the green wire, try not to get killed. But this world of bright, garish lights, elevator music, and 150 types of cereal, his head's exploding. He can't compute it. And that's a little bit what it's like for Duffy. He's in the world of IKEA and 150 types of cereal. Mm-hmm. And then he takes the ferry over to Belfast. And it's Gazelle helicopters 1,000 feet up and armed soldiers on the streets and people trying to kill you every day. And how do you process that in your head? Can you process that in your head? I don't know. It's to me, that's a really interesting territory to explore.
It's when you brought up the Hurt Locker and you said, well, there's one specific scene. I was like, well, what scene do I remember? And I was like, oh, it's the supermarket scene. Before you said it, that there's something so striking about that scene that stays with you as the viewer. I think kind of what the commonality is between Jeremy Renner's character in that movie and Sean Duffy is that once you are in an existence where the only things that matter are life and death, re-entering kind of the absurdity of society and capitalism just feels like you just see through it so much when you're used to life and death. Like those are the things that matter. And then you're like, wow, all of this is so bizarre right now.
And it's also funny because there's, it's a police procedural, and all the Duffy novels are police procedurals. But I think what makes them a little bit different is that even ordinary policemen, detectives, plainclothes guys who are sort of intellectual guys solving cases, their lives are in jeopardy. And there's bits where there will be, and I've talked to a lot of policemen about this, they'll be involved in a gun battle or a riot, or they'll be seconded into riot duty. And that's also hard to compute in your head. Just go, we're supposed to be the intellectuals of the police force. The thinkers, the guys sitting in a room with a glass of whiskey trying to solve all these. But here we are in a shootout for real. So that a lot of them have to compute that kind of stuff. It's a difficult headspace to be in. But as a writer, gold. Really, really fun to explore that world.
I think, branching off of that, what I really enjoy about Duffy as a character is that he's a police detective. He takes his job very seriously, but he's also very funny in a very kind of dark, sardonic way. I was wondering, where is that sense of humor just something that comes naturally to you, or is that something that you kind of discovered while you were writing the character, or is it something that is really maybe kind of just like a part of what life was like during the troubles of being able to cope with humor?
Well, I mean, here's where I suppose I could be a wee bit controversial. Is they've made a lot of films about the troubles, a lot of them, and they're all terrible. And they're all terrible for the same reason, is that they are usually made by outsiders who come to Belfast, who have this story, and they always play the same doleful music. It's always the same depressing arc, tragic arc, and they're all so grim and terrible. And that wasn't my memory of what life was like in the 80s. I remember just it being really, really funny. Like something happened, and then the next day in the playground, there'd be 20 jokes about it that these wee muckers had made up, these terrible black humor jokes. How do you think of this? And there's like 10 different jokes. And it wasn't until I saw Derry Girls. I don't know if you've seen Derry Girls, and that's a slightly different generation for me. She grew up in the 90s. I grew up in the 80s. And then I said, no, that's finally something that's captured the way I was, because it was very, very funny. And the people were desperately trying to outdo themselves to think up jokes. The way you would get a girlfriend would be to make her laugh. And the worst thing a father could say about a boyfriend after he's come over and been introduced to the family, the worst thing a father could say, well, he doesn't have much of a sense of humor. That's death. He's never going to be accepted by the family. And the girls go, hey, well, I'm going to have to dump him. Because it was all about the joke. So that was my experience of life there. And that's why I hate all those films. I hate Cal, and I hate The Crying Game, and I hate A Prayer for the Dying, and I hate all those films. And not Clear and Present Danger. Is it Clear and Present Danger? I can't remember the Harrison Ford one. I hate them all because that's not close to being a reflection of Northern Ireland. because Northern Ireland is a really, really funny place. And the people are very, very funny. And Dairy Girls is accurate. The other ones are rubbish. I mean, they're really, really bad. When I started this series with the first one, I thought to myself, I'm going to do it like it was. There's going to be darkness. There's going to be deep darkness, but there's also going to be jokes. There's going to be levity. There's going to be light, because that's the way people coped. I mean, that was their coping mechanism, was to make jokes, be ironic, be sarcastic, and there's no way you could have lived that life without the humor. And so the coppers have a very dark sense of humor, and the civilians do as well, and basically everybody does.
I'm curious, if you having such a dark sense of humor, which I will also be the first to admit that my sense of humor skews very dark, and just something that I've encountered in my life is that sometimes people don't really like dark humor all the time, and sometimes people, everyone has their different limits. Have you ever had a joke or a bit or something in a novel and someone else reads it? Maybe it's a publisher, maybe it's someone else who's like, you really can't do this one.
Yeah, all the time. I have a lot of English editors and say, oh, well, this is tonally inappropriate what I'd done before. And they would say, look, you're dealing with some very serious issues, and in the very next chapter you have these coppers cracking wise or making jokes or whatever. It's a tonal clash, and they want tonal consistency. That always strikes me as very funny, because a lot of those editors had gone to Oxford and Cambridge and presumably had read Shakespeare. And I don't know if you've read Macbeth. That Macbeth, imaginable, horrible scenes. Macbeth's wife is having a nervous breakdown about the blood in her hands. There's just deep, dark, supernatural darkness with the witches. And then there'll be Macduff and his family cracking jokes. Or there'll be, the levity in Macbeth. Even in Hamlet, there's tons of jokes. Even in King Lear. King Lear's up on the heath with his fool. If you remember, King Lear was supposed to be the bleakest and the darkest of the plays. In fact, has a lot of gags in that final act, especially when it's clear that Lear maybe has had a stroke or has dementia or something. It's actually very, very funny. And so I have had some pushback from that, where they say, you've got to be, tonally consistent. And I always wonder why. Why do you have to be tonally consistent? Because Shakespeare wasn't. The Greeks and the Romans weren't. Dickens certainly wasn't. My God, Dickens would have scenes of heartbreaking poverty and child poverty and horrible circumstances, and then jokes in the very next chapter. So I think you've got to reflect life. And life is everything. It's the darkness and the light. It's, the humor and the tragedy, and you just got to throw them all in together. And this idea that you have to have one tone throughout an entire novel, it just seems silly.
Right. Life is, to your point, tonally inconsistent, right? Branching off of that, I mean, I think we can, while we're talking about that kind of the darkness, a novel that really had an impact on people and certainly was a big deal for Barnes & Noble. There was a mystery and thriller monthly pick, was The Chain, which you also wrote, which is not a part of the Sean Duffy series. But that, I think it's remarkable, because I can't think of another book where I can simply pitch it to someone and it disturbs them to their core.
Yeah.
Once you hear that premise, it stays with you. I think it's incredibly dark. It's incredibly memorable. How do you come up with something like that and then flesh it out in that way?
Well, I'd had the idea for a long time. That idea had been in my head for a long, long time. Mm-hmm. And when I was writing the Duffy series, I thought, but I knew it was going to be tough to write. Just the idea of child kidnap, I knew that's a heavy subject and it's tough to write. And I also knew that what I was going to put Rachel through. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, I'm going to have the day her child is kidnapped is not the worst day of her life. The worst day of her life is going to be the next day and the day after that and the day after that. And so I put off writing that book for a couple of years because I knew it would be quite harrowing to write it. And then when I finally got the courage to write it, then the actual writing process, funnily enough, was pretty straightforward because it all flowed organically and logically. Like once you set up all those dominoes and just pushed one, you just think, well, it actually wasn't that difficult. What happens next? What happens next? What happens next? What would you do in that situation? There's not a lot of time to think. You just react and you just follow your instincts. And so that one, funnily enough, I thought it was going to be a nightmare to write it. I thought, oh my God, Adrian, you're going to be going to some dark, dark places here. This is going to be so, so awful to write. But actually, as a writer, it was pretty easy. Because I got stuck, I think, 2 or 3 times in that book, and I thought and then I figured out a terrible way of breaking the logjam. The terrible way was, I said, well, what's going to happen here? And then I thought, well, what's the worst thing that could happen now? What's the worst thing that could happen? And I go, oh, it'd be terrible if that happened. And then I would write it. And then later on, like 60 pages later, I thought, well, what's the worst thing that could happen now? And then 60 pages later, so every time I got stuck, I just thought, oh, what can I put this poor woman through now? And then put her through it. But knowing that she would triumph over adversity and that she would raise her game, and I respected her. The more, Rachel, the more I wrote that book, the more I fell in love with her as a character, and the more just my esteem for her rose. I just thought, oh my God, these people that have done this to her, then have made a huge mistake. They wrong person to mess with. They have no idea what this woman is capable of. That I have no idea when I started it. And then by the end, I thought, no one's going to ever mess with this woman for or if they do, they're really, really going to regret it.
When you're, I guess, developing or thinking of stories where you have ideas that come to your head, how do you distinguish between what would be a standalone novel with a new character like The Chain with Rachel versus something that would be a part of the Sean Duffy kind of series? Because was there any inkling in your mind of like, well, could I adapt this in a way that would be something that Sean Duffy is like confronting?
To me, they're just completely different. The Duffy is so mixed up in the milieu and the atmosphere and the mood and the tone. And the Duffy books are completely different. It's a completely different type of writing. To me, a Duffy book is a noir. To me, the sort of the most important factors in a noir are you really have to capture the mood. You have to capture the tone. You have to capture the atmosphere. You're giving people a world, and you're giving people characters. I think with a thriller, especially a standalone thriller, the mood, the tone, the milieu are less important than story and character. And I think you really have to have completely compelling characters who jump off the page in the first chapter, first 2 chapters at the most. And you have to have the sense of boom over a waterfall in the first couple of chapters. Thrillers, the pages have to turn. Otherwise, what's the point? A thriller, it's about economy, it's about pacing, it's about character. Whereas in a noir, it's more about mood. Like there's things I would do in a Duffy book that I would never do in a standalone thriller. Like you'll have this Duffy with his mates discussing, I don't know, the album listing on XL on Main Street. And they're going through the records one by one, just go, oh, that's a Keith Richards one, that's a Mick Jagger one, I don't like that one. You couldn't do that in a thriller. Not in The Chain or on the island. No one has time for that, any of that nonsense. The characters are on the run from the start. And so you really have to move. The styles are completely different, at least in my head anyway.
I'm glad that you also mentioned music, because that is such a big part of Duffy's character, is his eclectic taste, but also passion and extensive knowledge of all kinds of music, it seems like, especially, or including, I should say, classical music. Is that something that is that an interest or, passion that you have that you brought to the character, or is that something completely unrelated?
That's a reflection of the world. I mean, just when I grew up, everybody learned an instrument. There was just music everywhere. Like, I grew up in a housing estate, the projects, I suppose you would call them over here, and life took place on the street. And there were people playing guitars and fiddles and banjos and accordions, and just music was everywhere. Everyone was expected to learn an instrument. Everybody was expected to sing at parties. Basically everybody learned the piano or the guitar, something. Just music was everywhere. My dad was really into sort of Irish folk music and traditional music, and my sister Diana was really into classical, so I heard a lot of that growing up. On the radio, I grew up in a really fortunate era. It was like punk was going into new wave. It's just a really exciting time for music. And then my brother went off to college. My brother, being one of those hipsters who wouldn't let anyone go near his record collection, and he was headphones on, and we never knew what he was listening to in his room. And he wouldn't let my mum into dust. He just had all these albums, and my little brother and I were just going, "What's he listening to? What is this?" Because we knew top 40, and we knew stuff that was in the charts, but all this other weirdo stuff that he was listening to in his headphones, we had no idea. And then when he went off to college, he turned to me and my little brother. He said, "Don't go near my records." And so as soon as he was in the car to the airport, we were in there, opening his records, and this was incredible stuff. It was Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple and Miles Davis, and we'd never heard of any of these guys. We put on Miles, we got Kind of Blue, and I was turning my little brother Gav, "Is this good? I don't know. What do you think?" And then we take it off, and we put on Led Zeppelin's Physical Graffiti. Just go, "What is this?" And and so we put on all these the Kinks and obscure Beatles records that he had with Japanese writing on them. Just go, "Why, my God!" And because he was quite a hipster, and so that was an explosion. He had like 200 or 300 albums that he carefully curated for years and didn't want our grubby paws on. And we were listening to 30 a day of these records, and so that was also a big influence. 1980s music, top 40, my hipster brothers albums, classical, folk music, country music, and all came together in this wonderful melting pot. And so I wanted the character to have all those influences if I could get away with it.
And it's striking to me now because, as we mentioned before, he's moving. He's in the process of going to Scotland. He's packing up his house, but he is leaving some like bare bones essentials in Ireland because he's going to be using it kind of as while he's finishing the case and whatnot. And a big part of what he talks about, maybe even one of his biggest concerns, is his record collection and what's getting moved over. When is it getting moved over? And oh geez, I only have 1/3 of my vinyl record collection with me right now in Ireland, and I guess I'll have to get by with that. And it's such a different way of consuming music than we have now, where he could have all of that in his pocket. Yeah. But in the 80s, you had to literally make a commitment to having physical copies of all this music. And if you were going to have such an eclectic taste like that and you cared about it, you were going to be dedicating a lot of time or space, I should say, to keeping your collection alive.
Yeah, absolutely. Time and space, and just cleaning them, keeping the record sleeves, in peace. And I have a lot of my records are in storage lockers, but my daughter has recently got into vinyl, and she's been going through this because she's going to college in October, and so she's been having this agony. Well, which records? I can't take them all. Which records? And I was going, "Welcome to my world, you Generation Z." So I'm delighted about that, and they also appreciate the kids that it's just not the same. It's just not the same on a phone the physical beauty and the process of taking a vinyl out of its sleeve and putting it on the turntable and turning the turntable on and getting that little cloth to brush off the static and then putting, oh my God, the whole process, it's meditative and gorgeous and beautiful. And then when you hear the song itself, it's been such a palaver. It's such a process to get it on. You're already tensed and ready to hear it in a way that you wouldn't be if it's just a random shuffle on your phone. You're worshiping the music and connecting with it in a more singular, deeper way. And I like the fact that Duffy does that because a lot of us old timers still do that as well.
Also, I mean, I think as we mentioned before, this novel is taking place in 1990. Yeah, it's literally the start of 1990, right? In this conversation, talking about music, you can't talk about the 1990s without talking about the rise and advent of CDs as becoming the new dominant form of getting music, buying music, listening to music. Is that something, I guess maybe this is a two-part question, but is that something that we can expect to see in a future Sean Duffy novel where he's going to have to navigate? I'm just curious to see how he navigates the 1990s overall, and that is one example of what I could see being a source of tension for him.
Yeah, Duffy thinks that people who are buying CDs are heretics, and the whole Catholic Protestant thing or terrorists, that's nothing compared to the apocalypse which is coming in the form of the CD. He thinks CDs were made by Beelzebub in hell, and they're out to destroy the world. And he takes it very, very seriously. And I have a lot of fun with, I think there's one of the cases where one of his underlings, Lawson, gives him a CD of the new U2 record. And for Duffy, it's like a vampire being given a crucifix wrapped in garlic. He's going, what is this abomination before my eyes? And so I do have a lot of fun with that. I find that hilarious. And the weird thing is, at the time, I had both albums and CDs, but I did know a lot of old geezers who felt like that about the CD and thought it was the work of Satan. And the weird thing is they've been proved right, because nobody has CDs anymore. A lot of people have vinyl, and vinyl is collectible, and they're printing vinyl, or a lot of people have digital. But CDs don't seem to have the cachet, don't seem to have survived in a way that vinyl has. So they were wacky and they were mad, those guys, but maybe they were onto something.
Even the cassette tape is kind of making a comeback in some circles, which is pretty incredible. So maybe the CD will have a resurgence someday. We just haven't seen it yet. But in terms of the 1990s and the Troubles, in my understanding, kind of, can we say that they were officially over in the 90s, or they kind of came to a little bit of a resolution, or they at least cooled down to a more stable point in the 90s?
It was cooling throughout the early 90s, and then there was the first IRA ceasefire was 1994, and then the final Good Friday Agreement was 19. So I think if I'm going to write the final book in this series, which is unwritten, but if I think I would do a final book, it's got to be 1998. I think Duffy and his milieu is the Troubles. It's the 80s and the 90s, and I wouldn't want to see Duffy in 2020 complaining about Brexit or whatever. That just seems wrong for actor. I like him in the 80s and 90s complaining about the music and the bad food and the rain and being shot at. I move them in real time through the books. So when we eventually get to 1988, I think that'll have to be an end for the character.
So he cannot exist without the Troubles in your mind. He has to be in that environment.
Yeah, I think so. It would be too boring, I think, to have him in 2020 or 20. Sure. Still obsessed. It might be funny for a couple of chapters. He's still obsessed by all this stuff he was obsessed by. boys in the modern world. But otherwise, I think it's better to keep them young and angry and edgy in the 80s and 90s.
I know that I'd seen, correct me if I'm wrong, but you had stopped writing for a little while for financial reasons.
Yeah.
But you obviously, based on the fact that we're having this conversation right now, did return to it at some point. And I imagine that although there's probably a lot of readers listening to this, there's probably also a lot of writers. So I was wondering if you had any advice to give to any writers who maybe for financial reasons or for other reasons have been out of it for a while, but are maybe looking to get back in or would hope to get back in. Like, what can you share from your experience?
I took a couple of years off, or a year off anyway. I just wasn't breaking through. I had written a lot of books. The books were getting good reviews, and so I was getting sort of a pat on the back by the crime fiction community and newspapers and stuff like that, but nobody was really buying them. So I was getting sort of intellectual success, but no financial success.
Yeah.
And I had a young family to support, and my wife was a school teacher, and so I was basically writing a book a year. And then when you get that royalty check, and it's like, I don't know, something like $3,000 or whatever, you're just going, oh my God, I've spent a year working for $3,000. This is nuts. And my wife working as a school teacher for the time. I just go, this is the balance here is not cool. So I decided to take a year off and do other things. And I did a lot of things. I drove an Uber. I worked in a bar. I just did lots of different things. But then, sometimes, you can make this public declaration that I'm out of the game. But as they say in, is it The Godfather Part 2? It says, just when I thought I was out, they dragged me back in. And just when I thought I was out, I had the idea for the chain, and I couldn't let it go. I had to write it, and it was fun to write it. And I was writing it at night. I wrote it every night from midnight to about 3 a.m. And then, incredibly, it was my biggest success. And if I'd quit completely, I would never have known that. I would said, okay, it was I wanted to be a writer. I tried it. I wrote a dozen books. I didn't make it. And something to tell the grandchildren, hey, do you know that for a while in my 30s and 40s, I was a novelist? Really, Grandpa? I've got some. But actually, the only thing I'd say to writers is it honestly, it's never too late. You just don't know what's going to happen. One of my favorite recent story is Sean Cosby. So Sean S.A. Cosby is he's known now. Sean had been writing for years and years and years. He'd been writing short stories and novellas and a novel, and wasn't breaking through. And he was working in a funeral home in Delta, Virginia, just wasn't getting anywhere. And then he writes this book called Blacktop, Wasteland.
Yep.
And it's this book called Razorblade, Tears. And before he knows what's happening, he's on The Tonight Show. And his books have been optioned by Michael Bay, I think, or Jerry Bruckheimer, those guys. Yeah. His last book, I can't temporarily remember the title, but I was laughing to myself because it was his last book, which came out a month ago, had a full-page review by Stephen King in the New York Times. And this is a guy who was on the verge of quitting like 3 years ago. And so if I'm an example to anybody and Sean's an example to anybody, it's just hang on in there, because you just never know what's going to happen.
Look at that. That's two inspirational tales for the price of one. Not only your story, I think, is incredibly inspirational, but also S.A. Cosby, who's another bookseller favorite. I believe one or both of those titles were monthly mystery thriller picks here for us at Barnes & Noble. So we're so glad that you stuck with it and you came back. Super exciting. I really appreciate all your time. The new book is The Detective Up Late. It's the Sean Duffy series. 2 more questions before I let you go. Sure. Obviously, this is what's happening to Sean Duffy right now, but what is next for Sean Duffy? We alluded to it a little bit. Maybe he's definitely going to be in the 90s, but what do you see roughly in his future?
So Booker is in the can, so to speak. I've written a full outline for it. I haven't actually written the book, but I've got a full outline. Sometimes I'm a seat of the pants writer where I'll just make it up as I go along, Lee Child style. And other times I will carefully plan it out. And so for the next book, I know that one's carefully planned. I've got it all really plotted out, so I know what's going to happen. It's really fun case for Sean. When I write that one up, that'll be a really fun one. And then I have a new standalone, which will be coming out next year, which I have been told I'm not allowed to say anything about. I've had very strict instructions from editors and the publishers and people like that, and said, you're not allowed to say anything. I guess I'm allowed to say that I have a book coming out and it's a standalone, and I'm not allowed to hint what it's about or who it's about. It takes place on Earth. I think.
All right. That narrows it down. Sure.
Say that without people coming in there breaking my kneecaps. I guess I'll find out if I hear a knock at the door in an hour's time. Why did you say it takes place on Earth? We told you not to say anything. So there is a new Sean Duffy, and there will be a new standalone next year.
And you have some media adaptations maybe in the works for The Chain and The Island, perhaps?
Yeah, they've both been optioned. The Chain has been optioned by Sony Pictures. The Island has been optioned by Universal. So obviously nothing's happening at the moment because the actors are on strike. But presumably, when all of that gets resolved, there should be some news for me to break about those two adaptations.
Well, we will absolutely be looking forward to that. Until then, the new book is The Detective Up Late, number 7 in the Sean Duffy series. It's terrific. It's funny. It's dark. It's action-packed. It's a great mystery. If you're looking for something to read this summer, I would definitely check it out. Even if you're not familiar with the Sean Duffy series, I think this would be a good entry point. I think you don't have to have read the other ones to have understood it or to really enjoy it, I think. So, Adrian, this has been so much fun. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. I will just reiterate what you said. All the books are self-contained. You don't have to have read the one before. They all have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a resolution. No cliffhangers. I don't do that. I don't make you go by book 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If you read 7, you can be confident that you've got a beginning, a middle, and end, and that's the end of the story. And so yes, absolutely. Book 7, Sean Duffy, Detective Up Late. Check it out, and thank you guys for having me.
And I will make one last plug. All of those backlist titles, or most of them at least, should be available at Adrian's former employer and my current employer, Barnes & Noble. So stop by to your local store. I think you will be very excited to see all the changes that we have made in the recent years. So thanks again, Adrian.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.